What's going on, you jokers? Today we got another video. This one is about the types of reproduction. So there's two types of reproduction we're going to talk about: asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. If you remember way back to the beginning of our year, we talked about the characteristics of all living things. One of those characteristics was that all living things must be able to reproduce, right? It doesn't matter if you're this tiny itty bitty little cell, right? Remember, cells are the smallest unit of all living things, even a cell's alive. So all the trillions of cells in your body are alive and they can reproduce, even a bacteria or a larger organism, okay? All living things can reproduce. We're gonna jump into two types. Oh, before we jump into types, let's just mention that reproduction is strategy, right? It's a strategy of how to pass on your genes to the next generation. We're talking about two, asexual and sexual reproduction. One's not better than the other. It just depends on the environment, right? Because if one was better than the other, all things would reproduce the same way. Right? Why would we want to do something different if one was better than the other? Wouldn't make any sense. You can think of it like a restaurant. Here in California with In-N-Out Burger, they have a very limited menu size. They only got a couple things on their menu, versus Taco Bell has like crazy amounts of things that gives me a headache looking at, well, what do I want to get here? There's so many things, right? But it depends. What's the better strategy? It depends on your client. Same thing with reproduction. It depends on your environment, right? To decide what type of reproduction is better for your population to grow and reproduce, right? So with that out of the way, let's jump into the first type of reproduction, which is asexual reproduction. This is pretty crazy because this is reproduction when it only requires one parent. Only one parent and creates a new organism. So let's write that down. Okay? This is the process of creating a new individual, process of creating a new individual from one parent organism. Whoa, only one parent, you can create a brand new organism? That's right, that's asexual reproduction. That's crazy. What happens is cloning. It's creating a new individual that's an exact copy of the parent, which is phenomenal, right? So it'd be like a Mr. Henriquez, just creating a brand new Mr. Henriquez that's identical to me. That's weird, right? We can't do that, but let's talk about the first type. Binary fission is what bacteria do. This is how bacteria reproduce. So what binary fission is, you have one bacteria, has all that DNA floating around inside the cytosol, and then it splits in two and creates two new identical bacteria with the exact same DNA. All right, so let's write that down. That's pretty mind-blowing. Okay, binary fission is when a single-celled organism divides, means like splits in half, divides into two identical parts. Whoa. Single-celled organism divides into two identical parts, right? Identical in their DNA. DNA is exactly the same, so the exact same organism, right? So my example is a bacteria. EX, for example. Ooh, EX. Bacteria. And I'm going to do a really fancy drawing. Check this out. Here's a bacteria cell. And we know that the DNA is floating around inside because it's a prokaryotic cell without any membrane-bound organelles. Here's our DNA floating around inside. And then this thing, when it's ready to reproduce, is going to start to split in half. Whoop, whoop, right? Copy its DNA, and it's going to create two new identical bacteria that have the exact same DNA, right? Pretty wild. These guys can go on and continue to do the same thing. So something that's important about asexual reproduction, an advantage, we'll talk about advantages in a minute, is that it's really, really fast. They can reproduce really, really quickly. All right, so bacteria can produce new generations of bacteria really, really fast. All right, so that's the first one, binary fission. Number two is budding. So let's talk about budding. This is what an organism called the hydra does. Hydra is a pretty crazy organism that lives in the ocean. We'll speak about it in a minute. But budding is when a new organism grows off of a new bud grows off of the parent organism, falls off, then develops into an identical copy. So it'd be like a Mr. Henriquez growing out of my shoulder, falling off, and then maturing into a brand new version of myself. Whoa, we can't do that, but Hydra can. So let's talk about it. Budding. Budding. All right, budding is a new organism develops from an outgrowth. Outgrowth means like growing out from the body of the parent. So new organism develops from the outgrowth of parent organism. Well, that was pretty cool, right? Growing out of the shoulder, growing out of the body somewhere, falls off, turns into a brand new organism. So an example, this one's the hydra. So I'm going to write EX for hydra. EX example, hydra, right? Hydra. Hydra are these really cool organisms that live in the ocean. It kind of looks like a plant almost. But what it looks like is it grows like this. Here's my hydra, okay? This is my hydra organism. Now what happens, here's the parent. Then what happens is this parent starts to grow a new individual off of the body. So here's the outgrowth, right? So here's a little teeny bitty new hydra growing from the outgrowth. And this guy falls off and turns into a brand new identical copy. And we got two new hydras. Whoa, pretty crazy. Grown out, fallen off, turned into an identical copy, right? No genetic variation. Another form, budding, another form of asexual reproduction. The last form of asexual reproduction we're going to talk about is fragmentation and regeneration. So this one's cool. You've probably heard a lot about regeneration before, but fragmentation is when an organism breaks, like a fragment or piece falls off and then turns into an identical copy. So a lot of people get budding and fragmentation confused, but let me try my best to explain it. So budding, growing from the shoulder, or outgrowth of the parent falls off, versus fragmentation would be like if someone cut off my hand and my hand fell to the ground, my hand would then turn into a new Mr. Henriquez. Whoa, right? Humans can't do that, but an organism like the starfish can. So let's talk about that. Fragmentation. Organism, new organism, sorry. Organism breaks, and from the fragment, like the broken part, from the fragment creates, I'm going to go down here, new offspring. Whoa, pretty cool. So my hand falls off, my hand then turns into Mr. Henriquez. We can't do that, but starfish can. So my example today is starfish. So EX for starfish. EX, star, fish. So starfish. So here's my drawing of a starfish, right? Here we go. Here's my starfish. And what happens in fragmentation is a piece breaks, like a fragment has to break off. So something happens, cuts off that part of the arm, whoa, falls to the ground. Here's my broken fragment. But don't worry about the starfish. Starfish will be okay, because this is how it reproduces through asexual reproduction. This fragment is then going to turn into a brand new starfish, and now we're going to have two starfish, and this broken piece of the starfish is going to regenerate. So this piece is actually going to grow back. It's like the tail of a lizard grows back, right? That's regeneration, not necessarily reproduction. But fragmentation is asexual reproduction. When it falls off and that broken piece, that fragment, then turns into a new starfish, and we have two identical starfish. That's crazy. So remember, asexual reproduction creates identical copies, clones of each other. So we talked about binary fission, budding, and fragmentation. Those are three types of asexual reproduction. Now, I want to talk about the pros versus the cons of using this strategy, because I remember, we're going to talk about sexual reproduction in a minute, but we need to know, why would some organisms choose to use this type of reproduction? What would be the good things? What would be the bad things? So let's do some erasing. We'll talk about the advantages and disadvantages, okay? So we're still staying with asexual reproduction. So boop, 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 boop. Do some erasing. Get rid of this stuff. All right, so dirty board, there we go. Let's talk about the advantages versus the disadvantages. So I'm going to write advantages first. Advantages. Whoop, 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 whoop. Versus disadvantages. Disadvantages. All right. So why would some organisms choose to reproduce through asexual reproduction? Because it's really, really fast. Like that bacteria is just hanging out, splits in half, creates two new identical. Doesn't need to find a mate, doesn't need to find another bacteria to reproduce with. You can just split in half and create a new one. Pretty fast, right? So new generations happen really, really quickly. So that's our first one. Okay, fast and really greater numbers, right? So if you can reproduce really quickly, you can create a lot of organisms in your population. So it's really fast and greater numbers of individuals, right? The second advantage is all organisms can reproduce. There's no males, there's no females. All organisms can just create copies of themselves, right? So that's pretty beneficial if you want to reproduce really fast. So all individuals reproduce. Huh, that's pretty crazy. No males or females? That's cool. Right? Just split in half, create a brand new identical copy of yourself. Same DNA, same exact organism. So really fast, can create really great numbers, really, really quickly like the bacteria, and all individuals can reproduce, okay? That's cool, but what are the disadvantages, right? So this sounds cool. Why doesn't everything do that? Let's talk about some things that are kind of the cons, the consequences of using this reproductive strategy. So the first one is, there's no genetic variation. No genetic variation. What does that mean? What do I mean when I say genetic variation? That's right, I'm talking about DNA. There's no differences in DNA. Remember, they're making clones. So I'm going to write clones here, in parentheses, clones. They're identical to each other, right? There's no differences, there's no diversity. They're all exactly the same. But why would that be a bad thing? The reason that's a bad thing is because what if there's a change in your environment? What if you're reproducing so quickly and you like really, really hot temperatures for some reason, right? But then all of a sudden you're all identical and you're all exactly like that hot weather, and then for some reason it gets really, really cold. None of you are going to survive because every single one of you are exactly the same that loves that hot weather. Once it gets really, really cold, every single one of you is probably going to die, right? But if there's variation, some like hot weather, some like cold weather, and the environment changes, not every single individual in that population will die. So they can still pass on their genes for the next generation, right? So no genetic variation can be a bad thing depending on certain environments, right? So that's the first disadvantage. The second disadvantage is what I just mentioned, is that you're susceptible, because there's no genetic variation, you're susceptible to environmental changes, which means if the environment changes, you're not ready to adapt. So, oh, I gotta spell this right. Susceptible. Susceptible to environmental changes. Susceptible to environmental changes. So exactly what I just talked about. If there's no genetic variation and your environment changes, you're not ready to adapt. You're probably going to die. All right. So we talked about the first type of reproduction, which was asexual reproduction. We talked about binary fission, which splits in two. Right. One single cell organism splits in two. We talked about budding, grows off the shoulder, falls off, turns into a new identical copy. We talked about third, which is fragmentation. Cut off the hand, and the hand grows into a new individual. Right. Remember, humans can't do that. I was just doing that as an example. But binary fission is bacteria. Budding, you can think of the hydra. And for fragmentation, think starfish. All right, so asexual reproduction. But what's the different strategy? So asexual reproduction, we saw advantages and disadvantages. But what about sexual reproduction? All right, that's the second type of reproduction we got to talk about. So sexual reproduction requires two parents to create a new organism that has unique genetic variation. So there's differences, right? So not making clones anymore. So let's write this down. Sexual reproduction, process of creating a new organism using two parent organisms. Process of creating new organism from two parent organisms. All right, the process of creating a new organism from two parent organisms, right? So that's what a lot of more multicellular organisms usually do, right? It's a little bit more complicated, but the reason that this is beneficial, we'll talk about advantages and disadvantages in a minute, is that like the bacteria example that make clones, these guys create new organisms that are a genetic mixture of the two parents, right? So not everyone's gonna be exactly the same, right? So we'll talk about why that's good in a minute. But first, let's talk about what this really entails. So sexual reproduction, you need fertilization. So here's my drawing, right? What fertilization is when you have cells in your body. Remember, cells reproduce and they can split and divide because they're living things. So cells in bodies, your reproductive cells, actually split, creating, they start off as diploid. We'll talk about this when we talk about meiosis, mitosis. But they start off as diploid, which means they have a full set of chromosomes. But then they split and create new cells, which are called gametes, that have half the number of chromosomes as a parent. Remember, chromosomes, remember guys from the last video, chromosomes are DNA that's just packaged up really tight, so half the amount of DNA. And then those two gametes, a male gamete and a female gamete, come together. That's called fertilization. That develops into a zygote, which eventually turns into an embryo, which is the organism that's developing before it's born. All right, so let's talk about what fertilization is. Let's give the definition. Okay, fertilization is when gametes combine to create a zygote which develops into an embryo. When gametes, what is that? Gametes combine to form a zygote which develops into an embryo. Well, all right, so a couple of new vocab words here we're going to talk about. Okay, gametes is an important one. Let's do some color code in here. So one to really know, so we need to know what gametes are, and we need to know what zygote is, and we need to know what an embryo is, right? Gametes, zygote, embryo. So that's what my drawing is. Let's start at the beginning. We got the mama, we got the papa, right? They have a full set of chromosomes in each set of their cells. Their cells have all of the DNA inside. Remember, each cell in your body has a full set of DNA to create a complete new copy of themselves, right? But what happens is, so I'm going to write full set here. Full set DNA. All right, I have a full set of DNA, and then those cells divide, creating your gametes. So these are your gametes. So they divide, creating your gametes. Here's whoop, whoop. And the gametes in the female body, right, are the egg cells. So these are egg cells. And the gametes in the male body are sperm cells. These are sperm cells. And the cool thing about gametes is they have half the DNA. So this is a full set. These guys have a full set of DNA in their cells. Then they create gametes, which actually, through meiosis, which we'll talk about in the next video, they have half. So I'm going to write half set of DNA. Now, why would that be important? Why would you want to have a half set of DNA from your mom and a half set of DNA from your dad? Because this is sexual reproduction, not asexual reproduction. So you want to create a new offspring over here, a new individual that's a mixture of the two parents, not a clone of the parents, but a mixture, right? We want genetic variation. So we have half set, and then these guys combine, these guys meet, and when they combine, that's called fertilization. So this is fertilization here, right? And this cell right here is called a zygote. Fertilization, and this is our zygote, right? So gametes combine, egg and sperm cells combine to create a zygote. That's fertilization when egg and sperm combine, or the gametes combine. And then this zygote eventually develops into our embryo, right? And an embryo is just an organism that hasn't fully developed yet inside a mother's womb, all right? So we've got full set of DNA, creates new gametes in their bodies through meiosis, which we'll talk about in the next video. That's a half set of DNA. They combine during fertilization to create a zygote, which develops into an embryo that is actually developed and is born and turned into a unique mixture of two parents, right? The whole reason we do this is because we don't want identical copies. So let's talk about the advantages and disadvantages of sexual reproduction. The first one I've been mentioning a lot. The first one is you have genetic variation. So I write advantages down here. Advantage. Advantage. Right? Genetic variation. There's genetic variation, right? You are not exactly identical to either your mom or your dad. You're a mixture of your two parents. That's genetic variation, which we're talking about the environmental changes, right? That's a good thing because the environment changes. Maybe someone will like the change in the environment, someone won't like the change in the environment, but not everyone's going to die. Some will survive, some won't, but it's hedging your bets, right? So there is genetic variation. That's a great beneficial. So it helps with survival. Helps with survival, right? So that's pretty cool. But what's the disadvantage? Remember, there's always pros and cons. Remember, one's not better than the other. It just depends, right? Or else we'd all do the same thing. Bacteria would reproduce the same way as a human being, but we use different strategies. So let's talk about the disadvantages. Disadvantages. Huh. You guys have any ideas or guesses what some disadvantages of this would be? So remember, if we said a disadvantage or an advantage here is that asexual reproduction is really fast and great numbers. What's that going to mean for sexual reproduction? It's going to mean it's slow. It takes a long time, right? And not as many individuals in a population. So a population of human beings is a lot smaller than the population of bacteria. There's trillions of bacteria on this earth. There's 7 billion human beings, right? That's actually a big difference, okay? So disadvantages, that's slow. Slow. Not all organisms can reproduce. Right? Not all organisms can reproduce. There's males and females, right? Only females can reproduce in sexual reproduction. Another disadvantage is gestation. What that gestation is like how long you have to care for this embryo. So you got to take care of this embryo. In human beings, it's about 9 months before this embryo is getting ready to be born, right? So gestation takes a really long time. And then also once it's born, you still got to raise the kid. You got to take some time, so there's a lot of parental input. So I'm going to write parental input and just gestation. Parental input and gestation. Right? This kid's born, you still got to watch it for a long time. You can't just be like, oh, it's born, leave it alone, it's going to grow up and do its own thing. You got to raise it. You got to raise your kid, right? So that takes a lot of effort and a lot of energy. And another disadvantage, well, I'm thinking of all these disadvantages, is that you got to find a mate. You know, time spent finding a mate, right? Because not all organisms can reproduce, you got to go find someone to reproduce with, right? So it takes time, takes some effort, right? Could be potentially seen as a disadvantage, right? So quick recap, 2 types of reproduction. Asexual reproduction, when an individual creates an exact copy of itself, a clone, right? Disadvantage of that is that there's no genetic variation. Advantages is really fast, great numbers. Versus sexual reproduction, right, is when you have 2 parents, not just one, but 2 parents, and create an offspring that's a genetic mixture of the 2 parents. So variation is existing, right? So advantages is a lot of genetic variation, which helps you survive environmental changes. Disadvantages, it's slow, not all organisms can reproduce, a lot of parental input, gestation time, and also time finding a mate, right? So I hope this was helpful. Until next time, guys, work hard, get smart, and I'll see you later.